So if we move to the next slide, let's look at damages. Thank you. So if a court finds you've defamed someone, it's going to award damages against you, on top of the legal fees you'll have had to pay, plus probably the other sides too. So in court cases, normally in a civil case, because these are defamation at this stage, we'll talk about it just now, where it can be a criminal case, but mostly defamation is taken as a civil case. So each side pays for their lawyers, as we've spoken about before. And if the court feels that the one side has been badly behaved, for want of a better expression, they will often award a costs order against it, so that it has to pay for its own side's legal costs and your side, or vice versa. Okay. But on top of that, the legal fees are normally worked out on a couple of bases. There's general damages, special damages, nominal damages, and punitive or exemplary damages. And we'll go through those now. General damages are based on the compensation for the past and future harm sustained to reputation in the community, as well as the mental or emotional anguish and personal humiliation the person went through. And we've made a point throughout of saying that and maybe, and while I'm going through this, please put in the chat what your experiences have been of your experience with libel and defamation, please, so we can speak to that. But if we go back to the issue of general damages, proving compensation for past and future harm sustained to reputation in the community, okay, as well as personal humiliation. So you have to have a reputation to lose. And it's very difficult if you look at someone like Boris Johnson and you look at his personal life and you look at the stuff that he's done historically, he's almost free game in terms of any attack about his truth telling. Remember, he used to make stuff up as a journalist, and then during the COVID lockdowns in the UK, he made up his own. He issued these proclamations and these to stay at home, etc. And then he broke them. So it's fair game, once again, comment to that. And if he was to sue for that, A, that the comments were true, and B, there we're back up. Thank you, Timby. So it would be very difficult for him to show whatever damage he'd suffered. But Boris, I think, is a wonderful example in this, because he's almost got to hide like a rhino, number one, I think, to do the job he does, but also he doesn't seem to care. And he's one of those bizarre people, like those celebrities with the sex tapes, that almost get better with the more attention they get. So special damages, the compensation for specific economic loss caused by the defamation. And this can include things like loss of profits if you're running a company, or the loss of a job. Once again, if we look at the celebrities, and you look, there were the two actors, Johnny Depp was the one, and then there was the other one, unfortunately, whose name escapes me. Johnny Depp, with a gender-based violence case in the UK against his ex-wife Amber Heard, had massive consequences for his immediate career prospects. He ended up getting kicked off films that he'd been signed up for. And there was I think it's Arnie Hammer, who was also accused, never proven, but he was accused of GBV and some really unsavory behavior, and just almost got his career cancelled. So if he was to sue, that's what he'd be suing on, for special damages. Okay. And then nominal damages is, you can have there's nominal damages is basically where, yes, you have been defamed. you have been defamed, but you haven't been, but there's been no real damage. Ergo, that could maybe be a Boris Johnson kind of thing. And then I'll just go to punitive or exemplary damages, and I want to answer something on the chat here. Punitive or exemplary damages are additional sums which are meant to punish or set an example when the defendant's actions have been willful or malicious. Okay, so Silla Lowen writes here, I've written a feature film that exposes hanging practices relating to flaws in the justice system in Botswana. A person who is a likely psychopath got immunity, which was not disclosed to the defense attorney for 2 years. The DA centered his case around proving the psychopath's guilt. The DA's client was hanged hastily and in secret. The psychopath is still alive. 90% of my research has supported public domain court records. I changed names and pertinent details. Am I at risk of defamation? Okay, first of all, I've got to tell you, I'm not a lawyer. Okay, so you've got to be very careful. Don't use what I say, because don't sue me for bad advice. I would suggest that dealing with a psychopath means that you're already, you're going to be sued, or probably worse. The second thing is, and this is when we get to our defenses, I'm fairly convinced that you'd be at risk of defamation, but by definition, anything, and I think this is the key issue, anything that reduces somebody's reputation in the eyes of the community is defamation in and of itself. However, you've got a defense to that, and we're going to get to those defenses in terms of the public interest. So I'm going to come back to you, hopefully, but if you don't, if it hasn't been answered, please give me another, a follow-up question on that. But we will deal with that. I don't want to define a new legal term, but it's justifiable defamation, and that's where we're going to get to. How do you get to that? So we're on damages. When we were talking about punitive or exemplary damages, in 2017 in Australia, Rebel Wilson, some of you might know, the actress, was awarded at the time the biggest the biggest damages award by an Australian court, which was 4.5 million Australian dollars, and that was the jury that awarded that to her. 3.9 million of that award was for economic loss, and 650,000 was for damages for non-economic loss. So basically, one was about her hurt feelings, if you like, the 650,000, but the 3.9 million Australian dollars was what the jury expected she would have lost in terms of potential work as a result of that. Okay. The award of damages was for 8 different publications, not just one article. But there are many other cases of celebrities perpetually suing the media. We've got Meghan Markle, the Duchess of Sussex. Johnny Depp, we've spoken about. Elton John has been quite litigious. Politicians are quite litigious in different countries. Businesses are highly litigious too, especially when we come to the intersection of, we tend to personalize issues. But when you look at a firm, for example, wanting to do something that would be environmentally unsustainable, and there's a reporting about that, and the reporting is such that it changes the government's mind or the local community's mind, and as a result thereof, the company is no longer able to go and mine in an environmentally unstable area, or it's a pristine area, whatever, and as a result thereof, they're not able to make their profits that they thought, and their shareholders won't get the profits. They're going to sue as well, and once again, on the same grounds of defamation. Okay. When we look at aggravating factors, and I think this is a very, very important issue, the court's going to look at, can we just look at the next slide, please? Tembi, the next slide. Repeated publication of the offending statement and a repeated reliance on public interest as a defense when it's patently obvious that the statement is false. So you can get away with it the first time. And this is when we start looking at defenses and mitigating. You've got to be very, very careful. If you find out that that statement is no longer true, ethically, you have to backtrack. But also legally, you have to backtrack too. Once again, then it comes to malice or improper motive, or a delay, an inadequate or no apology at all when you found out that what you'd published was wrong. So if you take all of that together, you're ending up with a trifecta of horror. You say something, you find out it's wrong, you don't apologize, or you give a mealy-mouthed apology and you bury it. You know, if it's a radio station, you broadcast the apology at like 3 o'clock in the morning when everyone's asleep. Or if it's a newspaper, you put it in amongst the classified ads in the back. Or you don't apologize at all. And to make things worse, you then, once knowing that it's no longer true, you continue to propagate this view. The courts are going to smack you with punitive or exemplary damages. And this is a key issue now when we're starting to look at this whole issue of fake news and weaponized propaganda. And I think this is it's something to be arguing it from a different side. I think that you're going to start finding that when fake news sites are going to come terribly a cropper on this. And then, so as we always say, if you're going to apologize, make a virtue of it. Don't make excuses. Don't qualify your apology. Publish it with the same prominence that you did with the original article. And I think that that's vitally, vitally important that you do. It's the ethical thing to do. It's the right thing to do. And the courts will look very kindly upon it when they see that. And when it comes to, once again, comes back to the nominal damages issue. Yes, the person was defamed, but the publication or the media outlet did whatever they could to rectify this and ensure that everybody was the false perception that was created was then resolved. Okay. Could we move then? And then, sorry, that before we move to the next slide, if the offending article's on a website, you must put the apology above the offending article, so to give it context, or even best, remove the offending article altogether, but keep the apology there. And that's very, very important. Anne-Sophie Schroeder, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, would like to hear thoughts on cartoons and the controversies. Yeah, I think a cartoon is probably one of the best examples imaginable of defamation. We can take cartoons to a totally different level where it becomes, we have the Charlie Hebdo scenario, which is almost at the and Sophie, I won't be able to pronounce your surname in Danish. I do apologize. I see it she's correcting me here. But yeah, so we've got the Charlie Hebdo issue, which was, and that actually thankfully brings us on to the next one, whereas defamation is a crime. But if we just look at the issue of cartoons are constructed in such a way as to invoke ridicule, to be extremist, to make you think, to tell a story in one frame, and to evoke all manner of different responses and different feelings. So they are hugely, they're great potential sites for defamation. Once again, and as we come onto our defenses. It's exactly the same thing that we're going to have to do with cartoons. Is it true? Is it fair? Is it in the public interest? And then, then by all means. And I look at some of the cartoons that we see around the world, particularly some of the European ones, around this tragedy playing out in Ukraine, and if you look at how Vladimir Putin is being reflected, he's always shirtless, and he looks rather ridiculous. Okay, and he's a cartoon today where he's sitting on atop an intercontinental ballistic missile heading towards the Ukraine, but he's shirtless, and there's this kind of stereotypical Russian fur cap that's kind of flying off his head in the turbulence. But he looks ridiculous, but he's the one that was perpetually having all of this kind of performative machismo. So, not that he would sue. I mean, he'd probably send his troops in against you, but was Putin a businessman, or was Putin not the president of another country declaring war in another country, but someone else? He couldn't really sue for that kind of cartoon because he's dressed up like that. He's made, as I said, this is performative machismo, this almost toxic masculinity. And cartoonists have seen that, and they keep playing on it and making him out to look ridiculous. So that would be my my issue on the cartoons. The Charlie Hebdo thing, as we move to defamation as a crime, there's, up until now, we've been speaking about defamation as a civil matter, or as a tort or a delict, but interchangeable depending on which legal system you're with. But it's a civil matter is two people seeking redress, one from the other, for the court to decide. And there's a different onus of proof that's available. You just got to prove on a balance of probabilities. Where there's a crime, it's effectively that the state has to, that the onus is then on the state to seek sanction against the guilty person, who's then known as the accused, and then when it's convicted is known as a criminal, and then has sanctions that are far, far greater than paying fines, such as going to jail. And there's been a move away from looking at defamation or criminal defamation or criminal libel in many countries because it's seen as a possible chill on the freedom of expression. It still exists in South Africa, called crimen injuria. That's the crime, and it's defined here as the act of unlawfully, intentionally, and seriously impairing the dignity of another. And of course, in terms of our setup, it's very, very important in terms of the use of racial insults, racially offensive language, and then emotional and psychological abuse are all regarded as crimes under criminal libel. Okay, so there are two major issues, and there have been moves in certain countries, and ironically, there was a move in the Ukraine to bring back criminal libel onto the statute books in recent times. And it's something that I'd like you to be aware of in your own countries, to check if there is such a thing as criminal libel on your statute books, because if there is, it does have a chilling effect, because once again, because it's not a civil matter, the person you've defamed or criminally libeled just goes to the police station and opens a docket. It's then up for the police. It's up to the police to investigate, to hand over to the prosecuting authority, and then take it to court. So in other words, then there's no cost involved to the complainant. And then for you, if you're convicted of the offense, you'll end up with a criminal record, you will be fined and you might even be jailed. However, because it is a crime, there has to be the intention to defame, and the act has to be unlawful. So your defenses for the crime, and these will be in the notes because I know we've gone through we've covered a huge amount of ground today, but the two possible defenses for criminal defamation is that it was unintentional because you reasonably thought the statement was true at the time, so there was no intention to defame, or that it was intentional because the statement is true. And now, Tembi, let's move us on to the next slide, please, when we start looking at defenses. So the key is that it's got to be true. And in some countries like the US and the UK, that's all you've got to prove. Then you've got to prove that there's public interest. In this country where I'm speaking to you from, you've got to prove that it was true and that there was a public interest. And it's also that it's got to be reasonable. So when you do that, and this is when we get into the issues of whistleblowing and the protection of whistleblowing, because that's truth and public interest. But I want to give you an example of something I did a couple of years back, because I always say I've probably made more mistakes in my career as a journalist than most others. It's just that perhaps fate was more forgiving to me. So I was in a small town in the middle of the country, and the newspaper I worked on had been around for quite a while. And what we used to do is a small little banal point of interest for the readers was to have what had been published in the newspaper 25 years, 50 years, and 100 years before. And there was this particularly juicy case that had been run about 50 years before, where now Kimberley was the diamond capital of the world at one stage, but then obviously for South Africa, it was where the greatest diamond rush was, etc. And one of the great crimes that is probably unique to Kimberley in South Africa is a crime called IDB, illicit diamond buying. And there was, if you were caught doing that, you were sentenced to hard labor, and you were sent down to Cape Town to actually go and break rocks. And so there was this juicy case, and because it was Kimberley and I thought this was relevant to Kimberley, I did some excerpts of it that were to run of 3 days, basically 50 years to the day before. That's when this person was now getting tried for IDB. And I was stupid and I was not thoughtful at all. His sons, who were now middle-aged businessmen in their own right, sued me for defamation and won. Because although it was true, there was no public interest. And that's the key. It wasn't contemporaneous. And it's very, very important to notice that even though something's true, at a certain stage, people are entitled, and we'll talk about this in the section on invasion of privacy. People are entitled to their privacy and dignity. So you've got to be able to prove truth and public interest. When we look at the being reasonable, it's incredibly important to note that your sources that you had were reliable, and that the documents that you received were authentic and complete. It's also vital as a reporter to keep good notes to prove that you did everything reasonable to check on your sources and documents. The most important thing when you publish the story is that the subject of the defamation should have been given the right to reply or to comment before publication. And whether that person's comment or that organization's comment was used fairly and as fully as possible. Okay? Timing is critical. The urgency to publish versus the time given to the respondent to reply to allegations. So often, and once again, I'm very guilty to say this, but I have been guilty of it myself, where you know that an institution is going to be, they're going to try and subvert your story because you know it's all true, and then you give them a bit of time, but it's not enough time. Equally, you know, if the story is not critical, critically important in terms of time, hold it, get the response. Sometimes we're scared because if we give if we apply to the person for comment, we end up with a situation where we could open the door for them seeking an interdict against our story, which is a different legal strategy altogether. And I'm sure some of you have had that. The key thing is, whatever we do with this, it's about being the most ethical that we can be as journalists, given the restrictions, given the type of people that we're working with. And most of the people that, these cases that I'm speaking about right now, are cases in which the people are very, very streetwise, they're unscrupulous, and they're going to take whatever you give and they're going to use it against you. One of the reasons that people or journalists in South Africa, I've noted, are loath to give respondents too much time to comment, apart from the risk of being interdicted from publishing, is of course that what they will do is they'll go to their PR spin doctors and they'll take all the allegations, and instead of responding to your query, which will be based on weeks of investigations, they then go and rip the top right off it by actually issuing a public statement where they go on the offensive and they cast aspersions on all the work you've done by taking your questions and answering them in their own way and trying to get to reclaim the narrative. So those are very real issues for working journalists. But at the same time, if you have defamed someone, this is something the court's going to look at. Did you actually ask them for comment? Did you give them enough time to comment? Was it reasonable? Sometimes people will not respond to you because they think that you'll give them an extra week and an extra week, and eventually what will happen is that you'll stop, you'll lose interest. So there is that issue all along. Okay, coming back to defenses. So was it true? Was it in the public interest? Were you reasonable? Next thing is, you can say the statement was protected by privilege. So we've got issues where Parliament and court reports, commissions of inquiry, and other similar public bodies are actually privileged. So oftentimes in a parliament or any of those in a legislature, that which is said in debate is actually privileged, and that's often when politicians use that opportunity to make statements to the House which otherwise would be difficult to get into the public realm otherwise. Equally, when you're a court reporter, the cut and thrust of court cases with good barristers or advocates, they can rip the people in the dock to shreds. But the key thing that we've always got to remember is that, especially with court reporting, that privilege only exists insofar as the court reporting is fair. And what often happens in a court report, or in a court proceeding rather, is that in the morning, the prosecution has a go, and in the afternoon, the defense rebuts. A court report that only shows one of those sessions is going to be defamatory because it's not fair. Okay, very important on that.